Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Seti Warren, and I am currently the Executive Director of the Executive Institute of Politics here at Harvard Kennedy School. And recently, I've been the Executive Director of the Shorenstein Center. So on behalf of our Center Director of the Shorenstein Center, Nancy Gibbs, I want to welcome you all to this conversation this afternoon with some amazing, remarkable journalists. And of course, as you all know, this is the group of our 2021 Goldsmith Investigative Journalist Awards finalists. And it's such a pleasure to lead this conversation and hear from the incredible work that they've done. Just a few items before we get started. And a few words of thanks. First of all, it's quite remarkable. The Greenfield Foundation, founded this award ceremony and concentration on excellence in investigative journalism 30 years ago. And every year we've been able to highlight and celebrate the incredible work of journalists from around the country to highlight what's happening in public policy and government, shine a light on that, and make sure that there's a check on our public policymakers and our public servants and politicians. And over the years, the impact has been enormous. And so this year's class of finalists lives up to that standard over the course of 30 years. So I do want to thank the Greenfield Foundation for supporting this effort over the past decades. A few other items, in addition to currently being the executive director of the Institute of Politics at Kennedy School, former Shorenstein executive director, I have also served as a judge for the Goldsmith Awards. This is my second year. And I want to thank the hard, thoughtful work of each of the judges that joined us a number of weeks ago to make some very difficult decisions and call down the list to the finalists you're going to hear from today. A few other words of thanks. Thanks to our staff, Liz Schwartz, our communications director, and our events manager, Ali Hinsky, for helping to coordinate and put the logistics of all of the awards ceremony and this panel together. And I also want to just note that we have a new website this year, the Goldsmith website, which is really going to be wonderful because it'll archive previous finalists and winners. You can do a deep dive and understand how the work was done, the impact that was made, including those finalists from this year's. And you can find that at goldsmith.org, and it's a brand new site. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Finally, just some housekeeping before we start. The way we're going to do this as far as organization and run of show, I'm going to allow for each of the finalists to speak to their work, just spend a minute or so speaking about it, describing it. Then we're going to get into a conversation, I am, with the panelists and ask some questions. And then the journalists on this panel will have the ability to ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. For the audience, please, I'd encourage you to use your Q&A function to ask questions. If you think of a question along the way, enter it into the Q&A function, not the chat, and I'll be able to get those and ask your questions when the time comes to do Q&A towards the end. So that's the run of show, a little housekeeping there. As we begin, Nancy Gibbs often talks about the difficult work of journalists, the risk that journalists take every single day, not only in this country, but around the world, to shine a light on what's happening in some of the deep corners of not just public service and politics, but also in regard to corporations, in regard to NGOs and the like, to right the wrong and allow for impact to happen. And we're just so grateful at the Shorenstein Center, I know Nancy is, for the just amazing work of journalists in this country, around the world, that do that again risk their careers, in some cases their reputation and lives, to get this work done. And this panel obviously lives up to all those amazing standards, and you'll get a chance to hear that. One last word of thanks. I do always like to thank those that help this platform, broadcast this platform, and WGBH, who are partnering with us to make sure that you're able to see this, and we're able to have a broad footprint and engaging people for today's event and beyond. So thank you, WGBH. So with that, we're going to dive right in. I want to ask Janet first to talk about the work, this piece, American Justice, and a little bit that went into it, and give us an overview, please.
Sure, thank you. American Injustice is a body of work that Reuters produced last year, focused on US policing and the justice system. It started as 4 separate projects, and we realized quickly that we had an opportunity to produce a sweeping body of work on very important topics that were center stage for much of the last year, even while COVID was sucking all the air out of the room. We looked at the impact of qualified immunity on people's ability to get compensation in civil lawsuits against police accused of excessive force. We looked at deaths in America's jails. We compiled jail level counts of deaths, inmate deaths that the federal government actually collects but refuses to release to the public. We looked at police unions and how they make it difficult for cities to change disciplinary policies and to discipline and fire individual officers found to have committed abuses. And finally, we looked at the secretive processes for disciplining judges and the difficulties in removing unethical or incompetent judges from the bench.
Thank you, Janet. And you know, one thing I want to mention as we go through the panel is, as a former elected official, mayor, and also serving at all levels of government, at this moment where there's a real enlightenment in regard to social justice issues, the work that you did here is really remarkable, in that it goes underneath some of the headlines and gets into some of the reasons why some of these things continue to happen on our streets and in our cities. So thank you for that, for your work, and we'll get back to you in a bit. Tony, I want to turn to you and the work that you did.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So along with my colleagues, Tim Evans and Emily Hopkins, we spent months taking a look at Indiana's nursing home system. And what we found is that government officials here in Indiana took more than $1 billion in federal nursing home funds and used them instead to essentially pad the bottom lines of county hospitals. And so the practice left Hoosiers with some of the worst nursing homes in the country. And especially in terms of staffing, we found that we ranked 48th in the nation for total nursing staff. And we found that this, really contributed to many of the deaths and problems at nursing homes that arose when COVID struck. And so this was largely unknown to folks here in Indiana, the extent to which county hospitals had bought up nursing homes and were diverting the money that they generated from Medicaid to use at the hospitals. And so we had a lot of beautiful public hospital projects happening, but staffing in the nursing homes was dismal and people were suffering as a result. So that was the basis of our investigation. We also found that this funding scheme created a lot of opportunity for fraud. We identified at least $65 million in fraud over the past 10 years. And a lot of that was allowed to happen because these county hospitals don't keep a close eye on the nursing homes. They're using the nursing homes primarily to provide funding for the county hospitals. And so a lot of the fraud was able to happen because there wasn't close oversight. And so between the money being diverted to the county hospitals and the money being lost to fraud, it created a really bad situation for the nursing home residents here in Indiana.
Thank you for that overview, Tony. You know, one of the things that struck me around your work was how you weaved in some really difficult investigative reporting and detangling, you know, how Medicare works in states. And you juxtapose that with this very vivid, in some cases, graphic result of the malfeasance. And I thought that the human element connected with, again, untangling the shell game, as was quoted in the story, was amazing. So thank you for the overview. Look forward to getting into more of a conversation there. Abbie, if you could really tell us about your work.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm part of a huge team of reporters who worked on a project called Mauled, where we looked at police canines and the way that they are used by departments throughout the country. And so we started the project at the Marshall Project, looking at cases in Alabama, one particular dog and one handler who'd been involved in a number of really gruesome incidents with the police dog. But we quickly realized that this was actually happening in departments throughout the country. As we were reporting, we learned the Indianapolis Star and the Invisible Institute were also going along this same path, because Indianapolis had one of the highest rates of bites by these dogs. And so we all teamed up together, which ended up being, I think, just made all the stories so much stronger, because we had really in-depth local reporting, and then we also had national reporting to kind of widen the scope. Some of the things that we found were that, you know, there was a big sort of gap between the public persona of the way that the dogs are shown as cute. They're on Instagram versus the kinds of things that they're actually doing when they're released to bite people. We found many of the cases we looked at, the officers could not get the dogs to stop biting people, that the injuries that people were suffering, not only could they lead to PTSD that, you know, was really clear when we interviewed people, could last years, but some of the injuries were fatal, and you know, would really lead to lifelong debilitating injuries for people. And so we ended up having this sort of sweeping project with a database of cases from around the country, trying to really delve into the issue of how the dogs are used, and the way, sort of the difference in how the public sees them versus how they're actually being used on the streets.
Thank you, Abbie. And I, you know, on this one, as you noted, when people think about misconduct by police, they think about actual guns, other types of weapons that are used. What is not commonly thought about are dogs, and the perception that perhaps dogs are more safe. They're not as dangerous in a way. And I think that this story sort of shines a light on that, in looking at the tools that police officers have and how they're used inappropriately in different cases. So that struck me as well in your story. So thank you for your work. Joseph, please tell us about the work you've done. You're muted, Joseph.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, it's really great to be here. The Marshall Project, in conjunction with Mississippi Today, a nonprofit newsroom down in Mississippi, we took a look at the Mississippi penal system at two opposite ends. One was the incredibly violent and dysfunctional public and private prisons down there. At the other end, we looked at, it's not very violent, but it's incredibly destructive, the debtors prisons in Mississippi, which Mississippi is the only state in the country that has prisons where you are sentenced to a dollar amount instead of time. The stories on the violence in the prison started the year before. We had an internal audit leaked to us in which the warden of a prison there admitted that he was letting prison gangs run the prison. And this prison was very short-staffed, and that was one of the reasons why they would use the gang leaders to manage the prison. So the first story in our project, we looked at the effect on staff at these prisons because of short staffing. And the staffing is so short in many of these prisons that the guards are not safe. And so we went into great detail about the assaults, the PTSD, and then we followed that. While reporting that, we realized that the company, the private prisons, are supposed to be paying back the state for ghost workers. If someone doesn't show up to work, they're supposed to refund it plus a penalty. And we found that the state was allowing this private company, Management and Training Corporation, to get paid for millions of dollars for workers who weren't showing up for work. And it boiled down to that there was this perverse financial incentive that by short staffing a prison, the company makes more money, the prison is more dangerous, and the state wasn't doing anything about it. Our colleagues at Mississippi Today, in looking at the debtors prison, it just started off on a tip, and they soon realized that people were being, as I mentioned before, being sentenced to pay back a certain amount of time, a certain amount of money. And the whole system was a mess. People work at chicken plant in the day, locked up at night, but they didn't know what they owe. They didn't know how much money they still had to pay back. And the state auditor recently came out and confirmed all of the problems that they found in the restitution centers.
Thank you for that description, Joe. This was one of those stories where I had to read it a few times, not only about what was happening in the prisons, but this debtors prison, if you will, not being able to get out of debt is something out of another age in many ways. So it was unbelievable to read about something that's happening in the United States right now. The sort of in-depth investigative work that you did there, combining both what was happening in those prisons and the debt piece of this was quite remarkable. So thank you for that work. We'll dive into that a little bit more. Dan, please share with us about your work.
Thank you, Seti, and thanks also to the Shorenstein Center for recognizing this work. I am a Washington Post reporter, though until very recently, I was at Politico, where I did a project on the Marshallese. These are islanders from the Marshall Islands who relocated to the United States. And those of you who are watching on video, you might be able to see the Washington, D.C. street in the corner of my video screen. I am in D.C., and the story began about 2 years ago when I went to the Capitol to cover a rally for Medicare for All, expecting to find stories about Medicare for All. And I did encounter a story, the one that I never could have expected. There were two health workers from Iowa, Heather Rickardson, Cynthia Woods. They worked at Crescent Community Health Center. And when I asked them why they were at this rally, they told me they kind of stumbled onto it. But their patients, these Marshallese, needed healthcare. They were uninsured. They had been on the islands that the United States had, or their descendants had been on the islands that the United States had used for nuclear testing after World War II. And if you're like me, you might remember in high school history class watching the black and white videos of the bombs going off in the Pacific as the military tested weapons. And I had never known that there were people caught, not just in the downdraft from that, but really caught in the decades that followed of impact from what the US government had done. There had been an arrangement to promise healthcare to people on the Marshall Islands and some other island chains, but that promise was broken about 25 years ago in the overhaul to welfare worked out between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. Now, I've covered healthcare a long time. I had never known any of this. I was interviewing Heather and Cynthia, recording it. You can hear my shock in the recording to learn about this population that had been afflicted. I went to Iowa. I shadowed at the Crescent Center. They were very open and welcoming. I met some patients there. In DC, I talked to the lawmakers who had spent years trying to restore healthcare coverage, had gotten nowhere. And I really thought entering 2020, after I wrote my first story in January 2020, I really thought there would be a whole series of stories about the Marshallese across America in different states. I had flown down to Arkansas at the end of February last year to report on that population. But like so many, the COVID pandemic changed my plans. But more importantly, it also changed the focus of the story. The Marshallese were ravaged by COVID. Many of them worked in factories across the US. They had pre-existing conditions. They lived in congregate housing. There were language barriers that made it hard to communicate the risk of COVID. And most importantly, they were uninsured disproportionately. So that's where the rest of the reporting went last year, drilling in on the real risk to the Marshallese from COVID and what it meant for them to lack health insurance. And in the end of the year, in the final package coming out of Congress, Congress did move to restore their healthcare coverage after more than 20 years. And that affected about 100,000 people, not just the Marshallese, but islanders from Palau and Micronesia as well.
Thank you, Dan. That's just an incredibly powerful story. And what comes to mind as you were talking is, as we've heard many people say, this COVID pandemic has shined a light on so many inequalities and disparate treatment of different people. This is a real live example of that. We already had this pre-existing problem where you brilliantly went back and looked at what happened during the Cold War and the nuclear testing, all the way through the decision of the '96 welfare bill to now, and the results of that, and the reporting shining a light on it, and then having an impact made this year is remarkable. So thank you for that, Dan. Neil, please tell us about your work.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here, and I'm really excited to hear from all of my colleagues here. So this is very cool. For Targeted, our project at the Tampa Bay Times, my reporting partner, Kathleen McRory, and I looked into a data-driven intelligence operation at the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. We specifically looked into two programs under this operation. The first was a program that tried to identify potential future criminals based on arrest histories, social relationships, family relationships, whether people had been suspected of crimes, and other internal intelligence. The program would then take its list of targets and send deputies to continuously monitor and harass the people on the list and their family members. In just about 4 years, the past 4 years, the program had targeted almost 1,000 people, 1,000 Pasco County residents, and at least 1 in 10 were younger than 18. Deputies used several different tactics. They gave families code enforcement citations for things like their grass being too long. They came at all hours of day and night to bother families. One former deputy described the mission to us as making their lives so miserable that they either move or sue. Our first story was about that program, and then we looked at another program within this operation that also built a list, but this time of school children, kids in the county's middle and high schools, who could become potential prolific criminals based on data like bad school grades, bad attendance, child welfare records, like whether kids had been abused or witnessed abuse, and their own histories with the police. And we found internal memos and documents describing this program, but we quickly found out that kids and parents had no idea it existed. The sheriff's office told us there was no policy to tell kids if they got on this list. And even when we first asked the superintendent of the school district about it, he had no idea the data was being used this way.
Thank you so much, Neil. There's so much there. You know, over the decades, as we've been all, as I'm sure as journalists, as citizens, public policymakers, as we've seen various types of data and technology, regardless of the efficacy of that technology, being used in many different ways, sometimes in a very negative way to impact citizens. This story really uncovers the attempt to really, I think, in many different ways, break protections and laws that are in place in the United States by using, again, the sort of data technology space to do so, and the thought of people using that with authority, without transparency, really raises many alarm bells. So thank you so much for your work on that, for this, and digging into that important story. So I want to just dig in and do some follow-up questions and conversation with folks. Thank you all for getting into your work and describing it. I want to go back to Janet. You know, as we all saw in various communities, you know, the terrible film that we all saw of George Floyd, there was a consciousness, I think, that was raised, and I think with many people in and around America, around disparate treatment, racism, and actions of police. And as we know, there have been many terrible things that have happened in previous years. When I read this story, you highlighted a question and a particular legal ruling that has been in place for many years, qualified immunity. And I think for many people that were tuning in and trying to understand why these incidents continue to happen, this story really shined a light on a decision that's been with us for many, many years that could unveil maybe part of the answer as to why these things continue to happen. So Janet, first, before we get into the actual story, I think it would be important just very briefly to one, answer why you decided to dig into this, and secondly, to really describe what qualified immunity is, because that has been, you know, it's been starting to be reported a lot, and you know, part of what your work did was shine a light on it and get it into different outlets. So maybe you could speak to that.
Sure. So qualified immunity is a legal doctrine. It's actually a construct of the Supreme Court. In ruling in cases, they created this concept that public officials have immunity from liability if they are in the course of their normal jobs. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that. If in the course of their normal jobs, they are clearly violating someone's civil rights, you know, it's not a blanket exemption. You know, it's intended to protect against frivolous lawsuits, and, you know, that might grind government to a halt, that might give public officials pause in doing important jobs. But it's really kind of, I think as our project showed, it's gotten a bit out of control, and it has been increasingly allowing police accused of violent behavior, sometimes even behavior that judges acknowledged were likely violations of people's civil rights to escape liability. And it's because of the way the High Court has been defining the doctrine and making it more and more difficult for plaintiffs to overcome the defense. It's become so controversial that there are advocates on all ends of the political spectrum advocating for it to be either extremely narrowed or eliminated altogether. So in early 2017, Sonia Sotomayor, one of the Supreme Court justices, wrote a dissent in which she faulted her colleagues for overwhelmingly favoring police petitions for immunity. And in response to that, Justice Samuel Alito shot back that she had no data to support her statement. So whenever a data journalist hears there's no data, we immediately want to step into the void. So our Supreme Court reporters came to us and said, you know, is this something that we could analyze systematically? We have a bit of a crazy bent at Reuters where we like to dig into unstructured masses of court documents and try to bring some structure and analysis to them. And we'd had some success with that in prior projects. So we dialed up our pals at Westlaw, who are, it's another company owned by Thomson Reuters, and figured out how to amass all of the appeals court rulings that involved qualified immunity in cases of excessive force. So then from there, we came up with a systematic process of analyzing them and kind of coding the directives that the High Court had given to the lower courts, and we were able to track over time how immunity was being granted more frequently and making it more and more difficult for plaintiffs to win relief.
Janet, just two quick follow-ups. One, you mentioned the power of the police unions, and that's been a factor in this, and that's been reported as well. I'd love for you to speak to that. And I also want to note, you know, in your story, you outlined, and I think we've all seen, you know, we've got body cameras, we've got cell phones, we've got all sorts of digital footprints, but somehow that has not led to more accountability, but less accountability. So I'm wondering why that is, and I'm wondering, as you mentioned police unions, what the factors are there. I mean, we're talking about courts, and we're talking about judges. So can you speak to those?
Right. So it's a really interesting time that we're living in, right? Because we do have, on one hand, we do have more transparency because people are out there on the street with their mobile devices, taking video of abuses in real time and broadcasting them to the world. At the same time, we have systems in place that obscure they limit accountability, the accountability of police. There's no transparency in terms of police discipline and problem officers. So, you know, the qualified immunity pieces showed how the actual court system is limiting the ability to hold individual officers and police departments accountable for abuses. We had another part of our project we called Shots in the Dark that looked at the power of police unions and their role in all of this. And by virtue of state labor law, which essentially requires that cities bargain over the issue of discipline. So when police contracts come up for negotiation and a city comes in and says, we want to take back we want more oversight over police discipline, we want to change these policies, we want to allow civilian review boards to have a say in the discipline of officers. All of those types of actions have to be negotiated. And the unions oppose the changes. The cities are for the changes. They reach deadlock, and so the cases end up going to arbitration. And then the cities lose because all previous precedent is in favor of the police. So it's really difficult for cities to get any traction on real reform. We examined, we found a case of a man in Rochester, New York, who was coming home from the store one night and ended up getting shot by a police officer. And we kind of walked readers through how the police themselves were the ones who investigated the actions of this officer. There was really kind of questionable evidence in the case. There was never any, alternate narrative put forth. It was just what the officer said about why he shot this guy. And the guy ended up getting off. The jury acquitted him because the evidence was so insufficient for conviction. And it was a real study in how much control the police officers and their unions have over the process, over the investigation of incidents when police exercise force against civilians, and the ultimate outcome for the officers.
Well, Janet, part of this story is for public policymakers grapple over what the solutions are, is understanding the background and the history and what's happening today, and uncovering the power of the decisions that are being made by courts as well as the institutions such as unions. So it's an incredible, tedious work that you did to bring together some background and shine a light on it. Thank you for your work. Tony, this story around the diversion of Medicare funding, when I looked at the enormity of the amount, you had estimated at least 1 billion, but up to 3 billion. That is a staggering amount of money over a period of time that really should have gone towards the care for very vulnerable people. I'm wondering a few things here, Tony. One, how did you uncover this story? One, and second, what were the factors? I read about the chief executive. I mean, the chief executive in the story that was it looked like the mastermind behind this, was sort of seen as this visionary. And so what I'm curious about as a journalist, what did you face in regard to pushback, people trying to block you? You could sort of piece together a scenario where this is a guy that was sort of hailed as a hero, getting all this money, Medicaid money for the state, but then he's diverting it. What were the challenges there, and why did you decide to do this? How did you decide to do it?
Yeah, sure. So it actually started, and all of this for us started, well before the pandemic. Actually, back in the summer of 2019, we got a tip that there had been all of this undisclosed fraud that had occurred at the nursing homes, and Marion County, which is where Indianapolis is located, owns 78 nursing homes across the state. And so they're the largest nursing home owner in the state, at least on paper. And so, as we started digging into this allegation, my editor at the time, Steve Berta, suggested, taking a look at where this money is actually coming from that's allegedly, being defrauded. And so, it was that suggestion that we step back and take a look at the program as a whole. Why was this allowed to happen? And as we stepped back, we found that it was really the nursing homes that had allowed the CEO of the county health system to build a brand new, $700 million hospital here in Indianapolis. And so that opened in 2013, and he was really hailed as a visionary. He didn't raise property taxes. So this was done without any new taxes. He built a new public hospital at a time when, other public hospitals around the country were struggling, and especially those in rural areas were closing. And so he was hailed as a real visionary. But as we started digging into where this money was coming from, we found that it was through this program whereby county-owned or local government-owned nursing homes can receive enhanced Medicaid funds. So on top of the daily allotment that they get for taking care of nursing home patients, a nursing home that was owned by a local government also qualified for a pretty significant boost to their base Medicaid rate. And so the hospital had bought up these 78 nursing homes and then was taking those enhanced funds and using them instead, primarily, 70% for the county hospital to pay the bonds for the new hospital. So, and a lot of these nursing homes are in other places across the state. So you might have a nursing home that's helping pay for this county hospital, and it's, 150 miles away. And of course, the people in that community had no idea, they don't follow hospital construction in Indianapolis. And so they had no idea that these funds were being diverted in this way. And the state allowed all of this. So it was aware that it was happening, although it wasn't aware necessarily of the degree to which it was happening. And for state officials, it was a matter of, we're bringing more federal money into the state. And regardless of how it's being divvied up among hospitals and nursing homes, this is more federal money that we don't have to help fund because the hospitals were putting up the matching amounts. And so, for everybody who knew about it, it seemed like a win-win until you go and talk to families of nursing home residents who have these horrible bed sores. Or we found a woman who, had fallen 17 times, the last time fatally. And all of these horrible cases where these people just weren't getting the basic level of care that you would expect at these nursing homes. And in malpractice claims and wrongful death claims, the most frequently cited factor was inadequate staffing. And so the fact was that the federal government was pouring all of this money into these homes, but it wasn't resulting in, an adequate amount of care for a lot of the residents, according to their families. So that's kind of how we slowly, came to realize the story. And then we realized that not only had the Marion County Health System done this, but that 21 other county hospitals across the state had seen what Marion County did and had jumped onto that bandwagon. And so suddenly, as you said, you have more than $1 billion being diverted from these nursing homes. And so, this has allowed some of these public hospitals to compete with private hospitals, or in some cases, rural hospitals to, be pretty nice facilities at a time when that's a real challenge in most rural places across the country. But there was, this darker side that nursing home residents weren't getting as much care as they should. We talked to one advocate who said, given the fact that Indiana receives more of these enhanced funds than any other state, really should have the best nursing homes in the country. And so to be ranked 48th for staffing was, just shocking to him. And Indiana has about a little over 500 nursing homes. And so county hospitals now own 93% of those nursing homes. So the scale to which this program sort of took over and became the de facto state nursing home program was really shocking to us. And, obviously the nursing home industry and the hospital industry here in Indiana are really powerful. They have a lot of influence at the state house. They like this arrangement because it provides, funding that a lot of facilities in other states don't have access to. And so we did face a lot of pushback as a result. And the state has also assisted this whole program and a lot of the secrecy that surrounds it. So state lawmakers actually have passed laws granting exemptions to the Public Records Act here in Indiana, specifically for county hospitals when it comes to what they call confidential information, trade secrets, and even employee compensation. So while every other public agency in Indiana has to disclose how much they pay their CEOs, and while even nonprofit private operators have to disclose that in their tax filings, here in Indiana, the public hospital executives don't have to disclose how much they make. And we were able to find some of that information anyway by looking. Some of these county hospitals, while they're not nonprofits because they're government agencies, they do have nonprofit organizations that are affiliated with them that raise money for the hospital. And so through some of those tax filings, we were able to get a glimpse at a few of the CEOs' compensation levels. And we found that one, for a fairly small hospital chain, public hospital chain, was earning, had earned $8 million one year. So just wild amounts of compensation, right, given the size of the hospitals that they were running. And of course, the pay increased as they bought up these nursing homes. And so, it created a challenging environment because of the secrecy surrounding this money. But the glimpses we were able to get, revealed pretty significant redirection of money that was meant for these vulnerable nursing home residents.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tony, for that. And your reporting, some of the graphic nature of the neglect was really powerful, juxtaposed with your investigation of the diversion of funding. How the cover-up happened was quite remarkable. And just very briefly, the impact of all this, Tony, from your perspective of your work.
Yeah, so the longtime leader of the county health system here in Indianapolis was asked to resign, forced to resign after our stories came out, and unfortunately, we've published our first story just before the pandemic arrived here in Indiana, and it was somewhat predictable, but Indiana has had a higher rate of death among nursing home residents than most other states. So that's sort of one unfortunate consequence of what we've seen. But it's also prompted Governor Eric Holcomb to announce that he wants to reform the nursing home system here. And so he's looking into possible options for that, and says that he wants to, tie these funds more closely to quality in the nursing homes, and that he wants to put in a system where they can better track this money and see actually how the hospitals are using it, because right now that's sort of a black box.
Thank you, Tony, for you and your group's, your team's incredible work. Abbie, I want to shift over to you. And, one question I have is, what made you look into the use of dogs this way? Again, public perception would lead one to believe that that these dogs that people may see that don't encounter them are not weaponized the way they are. So one is, why did you decide to do it? Why did you decide to do it? And then, there were some intersections here with Janet's work as well, the qualified immunity question and some of the racial disparities as well. So I wonder, when you look at the work that Janet did and the work that you did, what the intersection you think there is there on both your stories.
Yeah, thanks. So first, it really started with one of my colleagues on the project, Challen Stevens, who's at Yale.com. He had gotten a tip from a lawyer in Alabama about this string of really bad cases in Talladega. And so he thought that was, he didn't know that much about police dogs and how they were used, and had reached out to one of my editors. And so we started looking just to see whether this was an Alabama specific issue, whether it was just this one case. And very quickly, Challen and I started building this database of cases, and we found really horrific cases in almost every state. And so we realized, in the first few weeks of reporting, that we had really a nationwide story about the way the dogs were used. And that took us down sort of this long path of understanding that, the dogs are being trained in Europe, and they are, bought there by sort of middlemen companies, brought to the US to law enforcement agencies, and that there's this really sort of whole kind of sub-industry around these dogs. And so it's just it's a big business as part of law enforcement. And I think also because the story started in Alabama, right away there was sort of a deep acknowledgement that that the dogs are very connected with race, because I think we've all seen the pictures from the civil rights movement of the dogs attacking demonstrators, and so I think right from the start, we were really interested to see how the dogs are being used, who they're being used on, and there aren't national standards on the way that police dogs should be used, and there is not national data on who they're used on. So we did Public Records Act requests, and the Invisible Institute, at the same time was doing requests with agencies, and so we could get some of that information. But not every agency tracks the data in the same way. Not every agency gave us race as one of the categories that they even looked at. So we did, get some hints that there still remains a deep tie with race and the way that the dogs are used. We saw that in the demonstrations that came after George Floyd's death. Here, I'm in California, and I'm in Oakland, but just in a suburb not far from me in Walnut Creek, we saw a young man who was at a demonstration. He was one of the few Black demonstrators, and a dog was released on him and bit him. He was a peaceful protester. He's an architecture student. He had gone out into his community trying to voice his view that there needed to be change, and he ended up with a dog tearing into his back. And so we saw that through as a sort of deep thread in our reporting that was especially apparent again in Indianapolis, because that department did keep statistics, and there was a racial disparity in who the dogs are being released on. And I read Janet and her team's work, with envy. I thought it was a fabulous series of pieces that really dug into some of the really thorny issues around policing and judges. And we definitely saw some overlap in the way that the dog cases, when someone files a suit, how people can be blocked from recovery by qualified immunity. That's something that we saw again and again when we were looking through these court filings. And And we also saw police unions come up as an issue in the way that, even when departments wanted to make changes in how they're using the dogs, or when a state, when the legislature is trying to make changes, that the police unions are, are a voice to try to push back against some of those changes.
Many similar themes, including the fact that COVID really shined a light on some things that were happening before COVID and inequities. Obviously, you described the use of the police dog during the protest, but this use and weaponize of the police dog were happening well before then, and rooted in some background historic disparities in race as well. That's excellent work. Thank you, Abbie, for going through that and describing. Joe, this just remarkable story that I think, as I said, I had to read a few times in regard to the prisons themselves, the understaffing and substituting people to actually run. But then the debtors prison is the one as well that was just incredible. The fact that this exists in the United States. I wonder a few things. One, again, the question of, how did you come on to this, and the difficulty of reporting this? Because when I read this story, this is so institutionalized. There's so many different agencies and departments that that are not just enforcing, but perpetuating both the debtors prison and what's happening in the jail. So I'm wondering, to start, I just wonder about that. And then I also wonder, from your perspective, the impact of your reporting is.
Yeah, so the debtors prison story started when our colleague Anna Wolf got a tip that someone working in a McDonald's was a prison inmate, but it wasn't a regular work release prisoner who goes out into the community and gets to keep much of the money that they earn, and it's usually right before you leave prison. That they were sentenced to an amount of money, and the real challenge is that the Mississippi Department of Correction was just absolutely unresponsive to all of their records requests. The questions: how many people are in these quote restitution centers? How much money do they owe? How do you track the money? And it was a real deep slog to get any information from the Department of Corrections. And we found the same thing when we were reporting on the violent prisons, is that we just got no response to calls, no response to our records requests, no response to our phone calls. At one point, my colleague Alicia wondered if the chief information officer there had died, because she had just totally gone AWOL for 6 months. So finally, Anna and Melissa managed to get a snapshot one day in 2019, who's in these debtor prisons and where are they from and what the charge is. Didn't give a number on how much they owed. So they called around to all the clerk's offices around the state and tried to get information from the clerks. And sometimes they went to the clerk's office. They eventually got these forms from the Department of Correction with the sentencing information, but they were literally looked like documents that had been copied into PDFs and then copied again and copied again. And, it was like almost impossible to read these, which it just shows you how the system was just, there was really no supervision. There were no policies. And the name of what they found out too, the name of the system, restitution centers, was a misnomer. So if someone's working at the chicken plant and they're paying back, their paychecks going to the Department of Correction to handle, to make restitution. Well, the first chunk of money goes to the Department of Correction to pay for room and board. The second tranche goes to pay your court fees. And the third tranche finally goes for restitution to the victims. So it wasn't about, if their priority is restitution to victims, it didn't show because the money ended up there last. Lost my train there. The other thing that they found, or actually was found by the state auditor in looking at this program, is that the management of the money had been handed off, unbeknownst to them, to the reporters, to a private company that wasn't keeping track of who's getting paid and how much money was owed. And so the state auditor found a number of cases where someone was still working at the fast food restaurant and had overshot the money they owed to the state by thousands of dollars, but they're still staying in these places. The state auditor also found that the Department of Correction had been destroying all sorts of fiscal records, the debit card receipts, the monies going in and out of accounts. They literally took the records to the burn truck. They just boxes and boxes of records. They take it to the burn truck, and these records were literally burned. And the auditor said this made his job, and he's got statutory power to go after this, it made his job more difficult because the records were destroyed. And we found that in reporting on the violence in the prisons, the same thing. It was so difficult for us to get records from the Department of Correction on this. At one point, we actually last year, we had an agreement with the Department of Correction for these weekly monitoring reports at the prisons. They agreed to give them to us. We wrote the check for $1,000 and change to get the copies. And the private prison company intervened at the last minute. After 6 months after we originally made the request and tried to put a kibosh on it, a nonprofit law firm came in and represented us. And we finally, just this week, after a judge ordered it, over a year and 2 months after we made the original request, and 7 months after they cashed our check, we finally got the records.
Joe, the one quick follow-up for you is in reading the profiles of the people that were part of this debtors prison. I guess I'd love for you to briefly speak to what you learned from them and what their feelings were of being trapped in this scenario that they just couldn't get out of, and there was no way out of. Did they, just from a human aspect, what did you hear from the people that you?
It's like the trial by Kafka. No one knew the rules. No one knew what was really going on. There's a lot of despair and hopelessness that I owe $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, and having no sense of how long is this going to last? How much more do I have to work? Several people the reporters talked to had it was so awful for them that they just walked off, which is not hard to do when you're and when you're working in the free world, to catch a bus and go home. But it was the inability to get answers and the feeling that you're just stuck. And sometimes for some of these, the point I forgot to make earlier was that sometimes it's a restitution center to victims, but a lot of these people were in there on drug crimes for drug possession. Who's the crime victim there? It's a psychologically fraught place. for all these folks.
Well, I'm glad you made the decision to cover that, you and your team, and shine a light on this, and make sure people know what's happening in our country today. That these things are not certainly outdated; they're happening in live time for public policymakers. I want to move to Dan. Just a remarkable arc of a story going back to, as we discussed, the Cold War and this nuclear testing and the effects on people's health, to the welfare reform bill to now. And I guess there's a few questions I have for you in looking at the arc of this story, which is rooted in decades of disparate treatment by the United States, decisions that are made. One is, why did you decide to do this story? It sounded like when you opened, the level of difficulty in regard to having people pay attention to it was very hard until recently. I'd love for you to speak to both of those issues.
If I'm being totally honest, Seti, I wasn't immediately jumping to do this story. I found out about it while covering something completely different, the Medicare for All rally. And that was in February of 2019. I didn't go to Iowa to shadow the Crescent Health Center folks until October. So in that 8-month window, there was a lot of thinking and reporting and talking about what the right story even would be. I was not the first person to write about the Marshallese. There have been studies and reporting on how climate change has affected the Marshallese. I was actually watching with my wife the show on HBO called The Investigation. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this show. It's a Danish show, but Kim Wall, who was brutally murdered in Denmark, she wrote powerfully about the Marshall Islands and climate change, and specifically some of the radioactive fallout that has persisted there. So far from the first person to dig in, but I think what I did a little bit differently, and perhaps this was as a health reporter and someone who wrote at Politico at the time, very focused on the political angle, was narrow in on that piece, that one piece. Why do these people not have the healthcare that was promised to them? What has it meant? And how does this get changed? And I know, Seti, you worked, I think, once upon a time for Bill Clinton.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, I did.
So I would bet, and originally my thinking was, as a Politico reporter, I will find Bill Clinton, I will find Newt Gingrich, and I'll say to them, your welfare bill 25 years ago, it appears accidentally left these folks without health coverage. How do you feel about that? That was my original conception of the piece.
Yeah.
As I was doing the reporting, it became increasingly clear that it was not a Washington story. It was a Washington oversight for sure, and a Washington story that should be fixed. But the voices that needed to be front and center were not Washington voices. They were patient voices. They were health workers and the people who were attending to the fallout, both literal and figurative, from this decision. So that's how the story came to be. And that's how it continued to evolve over about a year and a half, 2 years.
Yes, and there's a thread there, and of course there's a thread throughout this panel of decisions that have been made over many, many decades that continue to have disparate impacts on people in our country, like the ones you're talking about, including both of the bookends of the nuclear testing and the decisions around the welfare bill in 1996. And I think that thematically, that for sure, as we begin to look at these historical decisions, I think it's incredibly important. Just as we saw, the end point was Congress made the decision to ensure that people did get Medicaid funding, was sort of the direct impact from your perspective, Dan. But I wonder, through the lens I just mentioned to you, the sort of larger question about unearthing, thematically unearthing historic decisions from your standpoint, because you mentioned sort of the political question, not just the direct effect on people who don't have voices, but the political impacts. Can you just speak to that just really broadly, briefly?
Sure. And if I'm understanding the question, Seti, the political impact of pulling out this problem and forcing.
Yeah, and the importance of unearthing and reporting about it.
So there were lawmakers who for years, especially Hawaii lawmakers, because so many of the Marshallese relocated there, they were attendant to this problem. They were trying to force through bills in Congress that never really went anywhere. I think what was helpful was to have an outlet like Politico, and credit to Politico editors for this. I mean, once there really was some muscle behind this, there was a fellowship from USC Annenberg that helped in some ways legitimize the reporting, not just providing support to me as a reporter, but in my own newsroom when we were covering the pandemic, and as a reporter who was doing a lot of Trump administration coverage, to be able to say, this is something that has been deemed important. And simply by writing stories and offering updates in our daily newsletter, that created attention on the lawmakers who were pursuing this. It created some accountability. And I do understand from the officials I talked to on Capitol Hill, it created some momentum where aides like Megan Galloway, who worked for Congressman Tony Cardenas, she would take the Politico article and use that as entree when she was trying to convince other lawmakers to sign on to this package. So to me, it spoke to something that was very moving about doing this kind of reporting, which is different than a lot of the reporting I've done at Politico, now at the Post the past couple of years, which is simply by putting a spotlight on a disadvantaged population, that can have ripple effects that aren't immediately obvious. But once you start paying attention, so many good things can simply come that are well beyond the reporter's control.
Thank you, Dan. Neil, Dan mentioned a television show. This one reminds me of a movie that Tom Cruise started many, many years ago. This is, again, as we discussed, a local sheriff's department using data and an algorithm to, as you stated in your article, either harass or monitor people illegally. 1,000 people, I think you noted in your article. This must have been a tough local story to write just to uncover it. I'm wondering if you speak to that, and then broadly, Neil, what the implications are here, because this certainly goes beyond that region when we think about varying police departments and governmental agencies using tools to justify means to the ends that they're looking for. So can you speak, if you could speak to both, that would be great.
Sure. So yeah, it was a difficult story. We first came across this program and a manual for this program in late 2019. Kat, my reporting partner, had seen the manual tucked away inside as an exhibit in a long lawsuit against the sheriff's office by former deputies. But we honed in on this manual for this intelligence operation that described things that shocked us. The algorithm or formula was described totally in that manual. This operation to identify school children who were destined to a life of crime based on grades and child welfare records was just listed in this manual. So it shocked us, but we quickly knew this would be a difficult story. This program had been going on for years. The program had developed for many years. The sheriff's office is extremely popular in its county. The sheriff had run unopposed twice in the past 2 elections, something that hadn't happened in this county since World War II. The sheriff's office would speak of the program often in community groups, but not in details, just about successes and how they're using data to make policing smarter. But we knew that the sheriff's office was popular, that the county itself was very pro-cop, that it would be tough to write a damning investigation that would resonate with the residents there, and that's our job. So early on, we knew we had to speak to people. We had to speak to a lot of people, and a lot of these records and documents had never been made public before. We had to get them. We had to find out what was going on behind the scenes. We quickly found some data posted online for calls to service. And we noticed some of them were labeled as prolific offender checks, which was code for visits associated with this program, visits that didn't necessarily have probable cause or a search warrant, but were being made to addresses across the county. And in late 2019, Kat and I got on the road and started driving hundreds of miles across this county, visiting as many addresses we could, leaving letters, talking to families. And when we started connecting with the first families that would talk to us, first they were shocked. They had sort of accepted their situation. They accepted they were going to be harassed. Deputies had told them as much, that they would keep coming and coming. And as long as their name popped up on this list, deputies would be at their door. But they were surprised anyone was doing anything. They knew how powerful the sheriff was. They had tried to defend themselves. They couldn't. Many of the families we talked to were actually trying to save up money to move because that felt like the only escape. But they couldn't right now because they had no money, because they had been arrested during these interactions and could no longer get a job. But we knew this story was important, and we knew that collecting these stories, collecting the documents, collecting the data was really important to concretely show this program was problematic. We knew we couldn't, we knew we had to have a remarkably solid investigation. We knew it had to be backed by internal documents, by interviews with former deputies, interviews with people affected by the program. The goal the whole time was to be able to prove that this program led to harassment. And one other thing we had to do, which a lot of people on this panel know, is describing interactions between people and law enforcement is tough, because you get two sides of the argument and they rarely sound like the same story. And so we also took hours of body cam footage and reconstructed many of these visits. We built an interactive that walked through many of these visits and how they became problematic. And the sheriff's office defense was that this was normal police work. And we were able to show with body cam footage that this went well beyond normal police work.
That's incredible. Again, tedious, very tedious work with a department that sounds like they were not going to cooperate with you on their methodology or otherwise. One really brief follow-up, and then I want to allow some questions to happen with the panel. And that is, did the sheriff's constituents have an understanding at all at any point what he was aiming to do with this program? And if they did they embrace this idea or not?
That's a great question. It's sort of a mix, and there's no clear answer. The sheriff's office bragged about this program often. They talked about using data, being futuristic, and one of the top agencies in America using data this way to get rid of criminals, to get criminals out of the county. They were willing to say that much, but no one really realized who they were targeting and how it worked behind the scenes. I think if you heard the sheriff's office describe it in past conferences, it was a program to get drug dealers and the worst of the worst criminals off the streets, to get them out of the county and make the streets safer. I don't think anyone had any idea that there were people as young as 13 on this list who were being targeted by this program, that because early on it was decided that the program would focus on property crimes, that it wrapped up a lot of teenagers who happened to commit some property crimes. And because the program didn't have any clear third-party auditing, it wasn't clear how a resident could get their name off the list. There was no method to appeal the decision. We talked to people who, I remember one woman who was now an adult, had committed some crimes when she was a teenager, hadn't committed one in years since then, who was still being visited. She was visited first thing New Year's Day, first thing in the morning. She had 2 new babies, but deputies was there to bother her. She pleaded, asked, when will this stop? And they said, not for a couple of years. Your name is on this list and we don't stop until the name gets off.
Well, thank you, Neil. That's phenomenal work, and certainly for all that are in charge of public policy and laws to look at what's happening now and how people are using data, public officials, and technology to justify means. Very, very important story. I'm going to allow for panelists really to, if you have follow-ups to any of the questions or you heard anything, I want to allow our panelists to ask each other some questions. Go ahead, Dan. Yeah, sure.
I'll ask a question of Tony, whose series on Medicaid funding and nursing homes caught my eye as a health reporter, but also as someone who has tried to write about Medicaid supplemental funding in the past and found it very hard at times to make that real, these like technical funding structures. So I'd be curious if you could talk just a little bit about the conscious decision of how to take the funding issue and marry it to, as Seti was pointing out earlier, some of the vivid nursing home patients who were affected and making it more of a physical, tangible story and not just a funding story.
Yeah. I mean, we knew right away that a story about funding mechanisms, was not going to be especially enticing to our readers. But we also understood that, the fact that this money was not being used for its originally intended purpose, even if it was being diverted legally, had this real world impact. And so the challenge was kind of flushing out what that looks like for a nursing home resident, bedridden at one of these facilities, often hundreds of miles away from these hospitals. And, that was challenging because we were able to rely to some extent on nursing home inspection reports that are conducted by the state health department. But of course, you don't get the residents' names in those reports. And so it can kind of show you what's going on in there, but you're not going to get the full human side of the story that way. And so really relying on the malpractice claims was the best way for us to identify individuals who have actually been impacted by the low staffing. And I think that was really what allowed us to make that connection between the funding and the residents was those low staffing levels. Because obviously if more of the money had been used to boost pay or to hire more nursing staff, then, that could have solved the problem that a lot of these facilities have with being so short-staffed. And so it was really Emily Hopkins, our data reporter, who was able to use the data from CMS to give us, as clear a picture as possible of where we stood in terms of that staffing. And then making that connection with the lawsuits was not too difficult because almost, so many of these malpractice claims cited inadequate staffing as a primary cause. So that's how we were able to make the connection. And even finding those wrongful death claims and injury claims was difficult because Indiana's malpractice law is, they have to go through a medical review panel before they can even name the facility by name in a lawsuit. So there's sort of a level of secrecy there or anonymity that can be problematic. So it took us a while to figure all of this out. And Dan, I'm sure how Byzantine these systems can be to, I obviously go to the court records and look for lawsuits and there's hardly any. And the ones that there are versus anonymous nursing home. I'm like, what is that? And so then we figured out we have to go to the State Department of Insurance because malpractice claims have to be filed there first so that they can go through this medical review panel. And just, the learning curve on all of that is, we say this was an 18-month investigation, and that sounds, real, we've spent a lot of time and resources on this, and we did. But I mean, I wish it could have been quicker, but just figuring out how Medicaid works, how malpractice claims work, all of that stuff is just, there's a huge learning curve there. So that's sort of the process that we went through to finally find family members who could talk to us about their experience with these nursing homes and what their loved one went through. And once we heard some of those stories, it was, just heart-wrenching. And one family member, for example, told us about her husband who had been in one of these facilities, and as time went on, he didn't seem to be getting better. She thought, it seemed to take a long time for nurses to respond to his call light and stuff like that. And eventually she started to smell this odor in the room, and she thought, well, it is a nursing home, but it is kind of strange and doesn't smell good. Maybe I should ask about it. And she said the nursing home staff just kind of brushed her off. And finally, like, her husband became comatose. And so they took him to the hospital at her insistence, and found that a bed sore had been untreated for so long that it had turned to gangrene and had sent him into, septic shock. And so, learning about those kind of stories was hard, and it was gut wrenching. And I think that's really what helped readers connect, it helps cut through all of the funding mechanisms and what's legal and not legal and what should happen versus what shouldn't happen. It's like when you see what the result is and how it could have been prevented if there had been nursing staff to reposition that person every 2 hours, which is sort of the standard of care, to prevent and help bed sores heal, that outcome could have been different. So
Go ahead, Abbie. We'll make you the last question, then we'll wrap up. But go ahead, please.
I had a question for Janet. Of the stories in your series, the story about judges really caught my attention because it always seems to me like that's a very difficult group of people to report on, to get public records around, to do accountability reporting around. And I'm wondering sort of what were some of the difficulties in doing that story? And can you kind of get into the weeds a little bit about how you went about gathering all those records and putting that piece together?
I would reference the earlier use of the word tedium. We went to disciplinary agencies in all 50 states and collected what we were able to collect. And in some states, you can actually get public records that name judges and outline, what they were accused of doing. And in more often, that is not the case. The reporters looked at lawsuits, all manner of records. I think it's a lesson and process that we went through, not only in that story, but in all four of these, all four of the topics that we explored. There was no ready-made database for any of these. We had to build our own, and sometimes that meant converting documents into coded and structured data, and other times it meant just going around and collecting data from many disparate sources and trying to, like as you did in your project, trying to unify it in some way. But it's a slog. There's no quick answer. But whenever I hear someone say there isn't data to analyze a question, that's like red meat for me, because quite often there is data. It's just that no one has bothered to assemble it yet. And that can just be gold for a journalist.
Thank you so much, Janet. And the questions from Dan and Abbie are fantastic to end on, and the answers from Janet and Tony is great to end on. When you think about this discussion today, it's really, and I like what Janet said, it's this tedium, it's this dogged work and courage, never to give up, to expose, write about, shine a light on things that are not in the public sphere that need to be, that public policy makers need to see, and giving voice to those that don't have a voice. Through this conversation, we've heard that theme, the human impact of public policy decisions and political decisions made by corporations and NGOs that have a direct effect on people's lives. We heard it, at the top with Janet and her incredible work around the court system, unveiling and piecing together with data and information, qualified immunity, and some of the other decisions by unions that do not allow for progress to be made in criminal justice. We heard it certainly in Tony's story, and what happened in Indianapolis, and the diversion of funds and the direct impact of that on people's lives and the neglect. Thank you for that technical work. Abbie, just uncovering the weaponizing of these dogs alone is remarkable work, and connecting it to what's happening in police abuses today. Just shoe leather work there. Thank you for uncovering that. To Joe's work around unveiling this debtor system, debtors prison, as well as what's going on in jails in that region is remarkable. Dan, thank you so much for not just taking the historical work that you've put together and the work of others, but reframing it to actually have a direct impact for the voiceless. And Neil, thank you for exposing this use of data and technology for people's uses in public life, for their own making their own rationale for decisions they make. All of you, again, have combined shining a light on the human impact of decisions that are being made by these entities with incredible journalism and work. So thank you. I'm just blown away by what I've heard, and I know the people that have joined us are too, and we're grateful to you and the amazing, again, work that you've produced and put out there for those to see, to create impact. We appreciate it on behalf of the Shorenstein Center and certainly to our Center Director, Nancy Gibbs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been a real pleasure, and we appreciate all that you've done and all that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Real pleasure, real pleasure. Thank you.